don't even need to bother with that little trick. Hi, good morning. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI. Delighted to have all of you with us this morning for today's conversation. Campbell Brown talks teacher tenure. I think most folks in this room and watching online are familiar with both Campbell and the issue of teacher tenure and the Vergara lawsuit that unfolded in California, in which Campbell is in the middle of bringing to New York State. And we'll talk about what that involves, what she's trying to accomplish, the upside, the downside, and all those related issues. Format for today is the same as whenever we do one of these invited keynotes. Campbell's going to have a chance to chat with you guys for about 20 or 25 minutes. I'll then have an opportunity to ask her some questions and build upon it, and then we'll throw the questions out to you guys and to folks on Twitter. I had about 400 or 500 of the same tweet last night asking about who's funding Campbell's Partnership for Educational Justice. and why that's not disclosed, and therefore we will talk about it. And we'll hear what Campbell has to say on that question. Campbell is the founder and board member of Partnership for Educational Justice. It's a New York City-based nonprofit that advocates for school choice and education reform. The current project of the partnership is the New York lawsuit, supporting 8 families who filed complaint with the Supreme Court for the state of New York in Albany County on July 28th this summer. The suit focuses on 3 claims: tenure provisions, disciplinary adjudication provision, that's the long process for removing teachers, and seniority, retention, and displacement, what we usually refer to as last in, first out, or LIFO. Campbell's a former news reporter for NBC News, former news anchor for CNN. She had a show for several years called Campbell Brown on CNN. Easy to remember who's hosting it. She's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Daily Beast, and Slate. She was the founder of the Parents Transparency Project, and she sits on the boards of the Success Academy Charter Schools in New York, as well as the Jewish Community Project. A few announcements I just want to make quickly before we go ahead and get started, and I turn this over to Campbell. First off, please turn off all cell phones, unless you're going to tweet, in which case I guess just keep them on vibrate. 2, the hashtag for the event is hashtag Campbell@AEI, Campbell spelled C-A-M-P-B-E-L-L. During the Q&A, if you're watching on live stream, our own Mike McShane will be monitoring the Twitter feed, so feel free to throw in questions, and Mike will try to make sure we get to as many as we can. The full video of the event will be online, available tomorrow. And in a couple weeks, October 22nd, we're going to be talking about the future of the Common Core with Chris Minnick from CCSSO, Catherine Gewirtz from EdWeek, and yours truly. Hope some of you will see fit to join us for that. With that, Campbell, you've caused so much of a ruckus in the last few months. I'd love to get you up here to talk about it.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. Thank you for that welcome and for the invitation to come and speak to you today. It's especially good to see Rick here. He is not just a scholar and an important voice on education reform, he's also a good friend. And I appreciate the chance to be here at AEI. Preparing for this event, I read somewhere that AEI champions independent thinking, open debate, and reasoned argument. And I thought, reasoned argument? We're going to talk about education reform and reasoned argument? Is that possible? Seriously, though, I hold those values myself, so I'm honored to speak at a place that keeps them alive. I'm here today to talk about a new movement that I'm helping to lead that has a singular goal, ensuring that all of our students have access to good teachers. It is about tenure, as you've probably heard, but it's not just about tenure. It is about a system of laws in our states that have to change because they're hurting our children's chances of success. We are at the start of something big in this country, first in California, now in New York where I live, and potentially in many other states in the coming years and months ahead. This is a serious policy issue. It is a provocative legal issue. It is always a hot political issue. But it is also, I think, and this is probably a good place to start, for many of us, a very personal issue. For those who don't know me, you may know of me because of what I used to do. I was a reporter for NBC News for 11 years, and then I was at CNN for about 3 years after that. I used to host a show that for a little while we called No Bias, No Bull. My mom hated the name of that show. But that's how we thought about our approach to journalism. It was about holding truth to power. That's what I had been taught by Tim Russert, who was my first boss when I was in network television. My job was to explain, to push, to dig, but not to take sides, and rather approach stories with the view that both sides have some merit. And what I discovered when examining certain problems is sometimes both sides do not have merit. And sometimes there is no middle ground, and you have to take a stand. And for me, that became especially clear when I became a mother. I have 2 little children. I live in New York City, and when my kids started approaching school age, I started paying a lot more attention to what was going on in education in New York and, frankly, around the country. And I remember seeing in New York these unthinkable stories about teachers who had been found guilty of inappropriate sexual behavior with kids and had been allowed back into the classroom. And I was so stunned when I read this. This continues to happen today, by the way, due to the teacher dismissal protection laws in New York that are totally dysfunctional. So I started writing a little bit about these issues and talking about them publicly, and more importantly, spending time with parents who were dealing with these issues and the impact that they were having on their lives, their families' lives, and their children. And in time, I became what the media now refers to me as anchor turned education advocate. I am in this fight because I believe there's no debate about the fact that all children deserve a decent education. The single most important school-based factor to ensuring that they get that education is having an effective teacher in the classroom. Because I was spending this time with parents, listening to their frustration, witnessing the challenges they were facing, trying to get better teachers for their kids, I started thinking a lot about what more we could do to take action, how I could help these parents who were really feeling, frankly, pretty desperate. And I began tracking this lawsuit that was taking place in California, that had been filed against the state of California. Rick mentioned it, the Vergara versus State of California lawsuit that challenged the laws I'm talking about on constitutional grounds. And the lawsuit obviously became an inspiration for our current effort in New York. I founded an organization called the Partnership for Educational Justice, and we are a nonprofit whose mission is to help families, students, and teachers get the good schools that they deserve and that the state constitution in New York says they have a right to. In a rational world, the work we are doing would not be in the slightest bit controversial. In the real world, though, it is. And I think this is what happens when you try to change the status quo and you take on our current education system. Our action right now takes different forms. On one front, we're trying to mobilize people to mount pressure on our politicians to do something more to improve our schools. On another front, we're using the communications tools of our day to create awareness, to try to get people more engaged on these issues. And then there's the approach that has me standing in front of you today, which is turning to the courts for justice. This is not a general campaign of filing lawsuits. Our goal here is not to be litigious, but rather targeted lawsuits designed to get right to the heart of the problem in a given state that can shake the system up in a lasting and a beneficial way. Now, knowing that my good friend Rick Hess is not a fan of litigation, let me also say this. In the intersection of politics and education, history has shown that it is often up to the courts to be the body to decide right and wrong. They do so when all other people in the decision-making process fail to act: school administrators, school boards, mayors, and legislatures. And they do so when parents are so exasperated, so committed to helping their children, but left feeling voiceless and helpless and hopeless, that the courts then become the place of last resort. The courts are also a body that is designed to be fair, that is bound to follow the law, that is less apt to be bogged down in the political self-interest or, frankly, in sheer inertia that we see in other places. And the courts provide a hearing of the facts, and that's all we want. Our job at the partnership at PEJ is to provide organizational support to families. We are fortunate, very fortunate, to have pro bono legal support for these families from a team of committed lawyers who believe in this mission. So let me be a little more specific about exactly what is happening in New York. This is not my lawsuit. This is not the Partnership for Educational Justice's lawsuit. It belongs to 8 courageous families who are the plaintiffs here. It is about their names, their hopes, and their fight for their kids. In plain language, the lawsuit is attacking 3 problems. Number 1, tenure laws that keep ineffective teachers in the classroom. Number 2, disciplinary laws that make it unreasonably hard to dismiss teachers for abuse or incompetence. And number 3, seniority laws that reward longevity over quality. Put together, what we want is a system that supports, protects, and properly pays good teachers and makes it possible in a responsible and fair way to remove teachers judged to be incompetent or abusive. That's it. And the laws on the books right now in New York all work against that incredibly important goal. So let me break these issues down a little bit further individually, and I want to start with the first one I mentioned, which is tenure. This is less about the idea of tenure than the reality of tenure. The reality is that once a teacher has tenure, he or she essentially has lifetime employment. In New York, state law forces administrators to grant or deny permanent lifetime employment after 3 years. 3 years. Does that sound like enough time to you to fairly evaluate whether someone deserves a lifetime job? We believe it's an arbitrary time period that does not give school leaders enough time to make that determination. Now let's remember what the goal is here, because that often gets lost in this debate. The best education for our kids. That is the goal. That is the measure. So does the tenure law help meet that goal? We don't think it does in a legal sense or any other sense. Now, as it turns out, we have faced a little blowback for this position. Unfortunately, it has not always been that reasoned argument I mentioned at the beginning. So let me do a little truth squatting here. The most general accusation about our case is that we are going after teacher protections. So let's get this part right. Our parents are going after incompetent teacher protections. Shouldn't we all be? What is the counter argument to this? That teachers who do not assign homework or sleep in class or berate their students should be protected? I mean, try telling that to parents and kids. As much as this whole tenure issue gets framed in the crass political sense of reformers versus unions, I tend to think of it as basic common sense versus absurdity. Another nonsensical argument from the other side is that this lawsuit, if successful, will gut due process for teachers. Wrong. This suit is not intended to erode any teacher's right to due process, and it will not. All teachers, with or without tenure, have due process. Tenure essentially adds an additional layer of protection. What's more, the left-leaning Center for American Progress has questioned whether state tenure laws are even needed anymore. In fact, they have become obsolete because civil rights legislation passed over the last 50 years already protects teachers from unfair dismissal. So our focus is not on due process, it's on due progress. You know, the arguments in favor of tenure might be stronger if it had been proven to help students in class, but tenure laws in New York and many other parts of the country are not connected to teacher quality at all. Think about that. Job protection with no link at all to job quality. And teachers themselves know this is the case. Education Sector did a survey of teachers a few years ago about this, and the group found 63% of teachers said that the granting of tenure was just a formality, that it had little to do with the teacher's effectiveness. That's 2 out of 3 teachers saying that. So tenure is awarded too quickly. It is awarded without respect to quality. We think because of this, it has to be fixed, and it has to be fixed now. Pretty radical thought, right? Well, we're not the only ones who have said this. Arne Duncan, our country's education secretary appointed by our Democratic president, said, quote, "Awarding tenure to someone without a track record of improving student achievement doesn't respect the craft of teaching, and it doesn't serve children well." Most professions demand quality in return for our employment. Why in the world would we expect less when it comes to our children? Finally, let me address the other main criticism that we face on the tenure issue, and it is that we are going after teachers. Again, that just doesn't pass the common sense test. Here we have a set of parents who very specifically want more good teachers. They are devoting time and energy to trying to address this problem, to try to get more good teachers. Seeking access to good teachers does not mean you are going after teachers. So let me now move to the second part of our lawsuit, which is New York's dismissal statutes. When the schools themselves identify a teacher for discipline or for substandard teaching, of course that teacher should have the right to due process and to fair hearings, but not a system that is onerous to the point of being totally useless. In New York, one study found that the average process for attempting to remove a teacher took 520 days. It took a staggering 830 days when it dealt directly with incompetence in the classroom. That's outrageous. It only takes 1 year of a kid's life to do real damage. So what do you say to those students who are never going to get that time back? Let me get even more specific about how the dismissal process works in New York. When a teacher is investigated for abuse, let's say, by an independent investigator and found to have engaged in this kind of behavior, instead of being fired, that teacher goes before a so-called independent arbitrator. Now, these arbitrators are chosen jointly by the City of New York or the school board and the union. They get paid as much as $1,400 a day, so it's lucrative work. And there's a financial incentive in that to drag these cases out for the arbitrator to make them go on as long as possible. Additionally, when an arbitrator is chosen, because the union has to sign off on them, they have an incentive to try to please both sides. They have to keep the union happy if they want to continue in this work of being well-paid arbitrators, because if they hand out sentences that are too harsh, they will be blackballed by the union and they will lose their jobs. The end result is that what we see are these incredibly lenient sentences where teachers who have no business being anywhere near kids are being put back into the classroom. And what's incredible is that the power, the ultimate power to make this decision lies with this arbitrator, not with the chancellor, not with the school board. This arbitrator has the final say, an arbitrator who has no accountability to anyone. This makes no sense at all. Now to the third part of our lawsuit that deals with the notion of seniority. The way the law now stands, teachers who have been in class the longest get priority protection in times of budget cuts or teacher layoffs. Here again, the problem is not with seniority itself, it's that the whole system is set up to protect teachers and not to protect kids. If unfortunately a teacher ever has to lose their job because of schools being in financial duress, when layoff decisions have nothing to do with which teachers are the best, is that the right approach? The Teacher of the Year in California, the woman who had been named Teacher of the Year in California, got fired during budget cuts a few years back because she lacked seniority. Again, this just doesn't make any sense. We just think that if budget cuts do prompt firings, the criteria for which teachers lose their jobs ought to be a little more thoughtful than simply who walked in the door last. Again, the top education official in America agrees with us on this. Arne Duncan said, if you have tenure without quality, if you fire people based solely on seniority, then you undercut the public's confidence in public education. That is the three-part legal challenge on behalf of millions of public school kids in our state. We have been working on this for more than a year, listening to parents, helping them organize, lining up the legal research. And it goes without saying that we are riding on the tide of success thanks to those families in California who tried this first. Rick mentioned it. I just want to go into it a little bit more for those who aren't very familiar with the Vergara case. Over the summer, a judge in California ruled on a case that took on the very same issues that we're pursuing here in New York. He struck down every single one of the laws we've just been discussing. His ruling was remarkably unambiguous. It was a historic victory for students and for their parents. Now, to be clear, the Vergara case does not have legal bearing on our case. These are different states and different laws in each state, but it does give us hope. It gives us hope, and it gives us faith that the courts will judge this case based on the facts, and it shows us that this can be done. The judge in the case made a lot of important points in his ruling, but one quote really stood out from the rest. He spoke about the evidence that showed just how much it hurt children to have a grossly ineffective teacher. And the judge said, quote, "The evidence is compelling. Indeed, it shocks the conscience." To back up his point, he cited a study that shows how ineffective teaching at a young age can haunt a person for their life. The study found that a single year in a classroom with a grossly ineffective teacher can cost students $1.4 million in lifetime earnings per classroom. And the deficiencies in teacher quality do not affect students equally in California and in other states. They hit at-risk students. They hit poor and minority students the hardest. And this is a reminder of why our challenge is designed the way it is. Teacher quality is a place where we can make a real difference. And you gotta focus somewhere. Some of our critics have very rightly pointed out that there are other elements in and out of the classroom that affect performance and the potential of students. And we agree that there are a lot of areas that require a lot more attention. We should give our teachers more professional development and higher starting salaries. We need innovation and leadership in our schools. We have to push for and allow for real parent engagement. We have to deal with poverty at home that affects our students' health and their well-being. But this is not an either or. Our push for access to good teaching is just one part of it, but we think it's a vital part. So here's a question for anyone who doubts that, who questions our motivations, or who takes a knee-jerk position in defense of all teachers, no matter what. What would you do if your child had a substandard teacher every day? Would you do nothing? If someone tried to intervene and tried to help, would you attack them? Why not attack the problem? As we go through this fight, there is one point that I think gets lost often in this debate, and which is why these families are doing this. Their role in this comes from the heart, and it comes from their heartache. If you spend any time with them, you see that this for them is a question of not why would they get involved in a fight like this, but rather how could they not be involved in a fight like this? And consider what has happened to some of the children in their families. They've been intimidated by teachers for asking questions or voicing opinions. They've seen their teacher fall asleep in class in a rocking chair. They have been called losers by their teachers. They have gone weeks without getting a single page of homework. They have been taught to have low expectations. Let me tell you briefly about one of those parents, one of our parents. Her name is Carla Williams. When Carla's daughter, Jada, was in 8th grade at a public school in Rochester, she decided to give voice to some of the frustration she was feeling about the kind of education that she was receiving. And she wrote an essay comparing the lack of education to modern-day slavery. It was provocative. But instead of using her call for help as a teachable moment, her teachers bullied her. Despite her previously high grades, Jada's teachers suddenly began failing her. When pressed for an explanation, the teachers gave none, although they did change her grades back to A's. Her mother tried to intervene. She asked questions, she complained, but there were no consequences. Jada went through an incredibly hard time and eventually had to change schools. And Carla Williams, her mother, summed it up this way: "We believe that when teachers act unprofessionally, they should no longer have the privilege of teaching our kids." These parents are brave. They are standing up for the rights of their students, and by doing so, they are standing up for the rights of all students. It should never have come to this, frankly. We have parents who are taking on powerful governments and the teachers' union, all to try to address these bad laws. And again, we are talking about a minority of teachers who are being protected by laws that do not serve children. But these laws hurt all other teachers too. Teachers are not a monolithic group. They are not interchangeable parts. There are educators who are committed to the task, and there are those who are not, just like in any profession. There are many devoted ones who frankly should not have to make up for the academic shortfalls of those who do not do their jobs. So let me just close here with one note about some of the silliness that has unfortunately surrounded what should be a serious policy debate. My role in this has been overemphasized, unfortunately. We have an incredible team of people. Jay Lefkowitz of Kirkland Ellis, who is litigating this case, donating his firm's resources, which will end up being millions of dollars worth of legal work that Kirkland Ellis is providing these families. The legendary David Boies, chairman of our board, an incredible spokesperson who is going to lead the effort to expand this strategy to other states so that we can help other families who want to take up this fight. Ben LeBolt, who is here somewhere, who is helping us navigate the media circus. Yeah. He's been very good at navigating the media circus, and I speak as a former circus performer, I should say. Look, debates around these issues are always going to be heated. I get that. And some of the crazy tactics and the theatrics that we have seen aren't even worth addressing. But there is one thing that I do want to address, and it's one I hear a lot from the other side, which is that I don't have standing to talk about these issues. I'm not an education expert. My kids go to private school, so I don't have a right to participate in a debate about public school. First, I am no education expert. I am sure most of the people in this room know much more about education policy than I do. I am learning, but I am certainly no expert, and I don't pretend to be. I am pretty good at helping people tell their stories. That's what I have done for most of my professional life. And because of my former life, I have a media platform, and I just want to use it to help these people tell their stories and to amplify their message as much as I can. And I think when you have a platform and you can identify a problem, you ought to use the platform to try to help find a solution. And to this notion that I don't have any standing to try to improve public schools because my kids are in private school, when do we become a country of people who only care about things that have a direct impact on our lives? I mean, when do we stop caring about each other? I literally can't believe that the teachers union's message here is, how dare I care about this? I mean, the single most important thing to me as a mother, the single most important message I want to convey to my children is that they care about other people. Is that they grow up to be grateful for the opportunities they've been given, and that they understand that they have a responsibility to try to help other people and make sure that other kids get the same opportunities that they have had in life, a shot at a better life. And I spend every day trying to teach my kids that. These are really challenging times in our country right now, and there are a lot of people suffering in this country right now. So not only do I believe that I have a right to care, I believe we all have an obligation to care. And not only care, but try to do something about this. So that's why I'm in this fight, and that's why I am grateful to have found so many partners on both sides of the aisle who feel the same way I do and who want to try to be part of the solution. So with that, let me say thank you to Rick for his leadership, and to everyone here, because I recognize a lot of faces, and there are a lot of people in this room who have been very supportive of this effort and other efforts to try to make our schools better. So I appreciate that, and thank you all for being so generous and listening to me this morning. I appreciate it. Over here?
We're right here.
To the hot seat. So go easy on it. Be nice.
So Campbell, so one is, just appreciate you taking the time to be with us today to talk about these issues. And I think particularly for me, and probably a lot of people in this room and watching, we've heard about the New York situation. We're familiar with Vergara, but we don't really know the ins and outs. So I think one thing that would be really interesting is just getting a sense a little bit of, so exactly how is this playing out? So first off, what are the details of the lawsuit? You mentioned a parent from Rochester. I think one impression some of us have is that these are 8 New York City parents.
Right.
Is that not accurate?
No, because we are suing the state of New York, we wanted to have a diverse group of parents from all over the state. There are 4 New York City parents. And we are also, I should say, adding additional plaintiffs. We had another plaintiff who joined us last week or 2 weeks ago. We are going to be announcing some additional plaintiffs as well. So we have Rochester. We have a number of other parts of the state. We want to have as diverse a group geographically, socioeconomically as we possibly can, because that's the case we're making.
And so talk us a little bit through what happens now. You guys, the lawsuit was filed in July. Where does it go? What's the time frame for seeing what happens?
Okay, so we are in the early stages of this process. Just to keep perspective here, Vergara, went on for a couple of years. So we are just getting started. We filed the lawsuit. I should also just add, it's a little complicated because there is another lawsuit that has been filed in New York by another couple of parents on similar issues. These 2 lawsuits are now being consolidated by a judge, which is a good thing. There's no reason that we should do this twice. And the next phase of this is that, in all likelihood, the other side, which is the Attorney General of the state of New York and the teachers' unions in New York, which have intervened similarly to the way they did in California, will file a motion to dismiss. There will be a hearing probably by the end of the year on that motion to dismiss, where, they hopefully will try to get this thrown out from their perspective. We hopefully will get beyond a motion to dismiss and be able to make our case. So I expect the timing on that will be December, January. And then assuming that we win on that, or hopefully we will, and get beyond a motion to dismiss, then the discovery phase begins and we're off to the races and having access to a lot of information about what's going on in our schools from New York City, from across the state, about what really is going on with our kids.
Now, as you mentioned, the California verdict was based on California state law, the California Constitution. Obviously, the New York situation is different. I assume the lawyers have looked at this. How do those differences play out in terms of the suit?
So as you think about this, and we are looking at other states as well where families have asked us to come in. Every state constitution is written differently, so every case is going to be brought differently. There will be different case laws supporting the arguments that are being made. In California, it was an equity case. I mean, they were arguing, and what the judge decided on was that there was a disproportionate impact on at-risk children in California. In New York, so the California state constitution guarantees the right to equal access to education. In New York, our constitution does not. What it guarantees, with the case law supporting it, is the right to a sound basic education. So that means that the legal arguments for our case are going to be different than California. We're going to focus on different things and have different evidence. If you bring case in another state, in Minnesota, the Constitution will have different language. So, an important decision-making, point going into whether or not you can do this in other states, because certainly since all of this happened, people watch Vergara, and a lot of places, a lot of people in a lot of different places have said, hey, we can't get our legislature to act either. We should try this here. You can't unless there is constitutional language there to support it legally.
So in California, Judge True's decision turned really on this disparate impact question,
right,
where he said, you know what, we've got a protected class here that's getting that is being visited with lousier education than these other kids. So that doesn't hold then in the New York case?
No. So no, that in New York it is that every child has the right to a sound basic education, which is pretty vague, but better than some state constitutions which have no mention of education at all. So if you were trying to bring a case in a state that doesn't guarantee anything, sort of any floor or any baseline for what a public education should look like, then it's impossible to bring a case. So look, I'm not going to pretend this isn't challenging to make the case that children aren't getting a sound basic education. But we have a lot of evidence to support it. And so we're hoping that the judge will look at this and look at the facts and go from there and make that determination.
And so the question there is to try to argue that what's being done in school systems right now and what state laws allow is not consistent with the New York Constitution?
Yes.
And that was the same thing that happened in California?
So, yeah, but with different constitutional language.
But the challenge then is to argue that the laws and the systems aren't living up to the Constitution?
Yes.
Got it. Now, do you know who the judge is going to be at this point? What court this will be?
Yes, so we filed our case in Albany. The other case was filed in Staten Island. They filed their case first. So the cases will now that they're being combined, will be heard in Staten Island. Yes, we've been assigned to judge. It's in the very early stages. Our lawyers have had one hearing on the consolidation, but we'll go from there. And again, I think our next hearing will be on the motion to dismiss this fall, and arguments on that, hopefully by December or January.
Now, the second case, how is the filer different from the 8 parents? Are they using the same lawyers that you guys are using?
So this is a little complicated, and I don't pretend to know the answers here. So the second case is being brought by some parents who are actually the plaintiff. The lead plaintiff in the other case is also the lead plaintiff in partnership with the teachers union in a case suing charter schools in New York City. So I'm on the board of the big charter school network in New York City, and so this is someone who has been on the other side of us on these issues, so and whose organization began with funding from the teachers union. So I was a little surprised, quite frankly, that this plaintiff developed an interest in tenure reform. But it is what it is. Any public school parent has the right to bring a lawsuit. So we have to figure out a way to work together. Legally, this has no bearing on our case. Our attorney will be able to make his legal arguments based on our legal strategy, even if they decide to pursue a different legal strategy. But it is, I'm not going to lie, it is a little unusual to be in partnership, in theory, with someone who is on the opposite side of us on so many other issues. That said, look, my view about this effort and about education reform more generally is that I want to bring as many people into the tent as possible. I do. As many lawyers who want to support this effort, as many parents who want to support this effort. I want this to be a movement of as many people supporting this as possible.
And so will they have the same legal representation, the other group of parents, as?
We have offered them all the legal support that they may need. They do have their own lawyer in this case. So my hope is there will be lots of cooperation along the way.
And so you mentioned that Jay Lefkowitz is representing you guys. Did Lefkowitz handle the Vergara decision, or?
No, the Vergara decision was done by a firm called Gibson Dunn in California and a organization out there called Students Matters. So they are not, my hope is that we will, as we go forward beyond New York, beyond California, that Gibson Dunn, that Students Matters will be very involved in helping us help parents in other states who want to do this, because they certainly did an incredible job in California with their success, and we'd be crazy to not tap into their knowledge and research that they've already done.
So you've mentioned a few times other states, the possibility of this going elsewhere. So we had Vergara in California. You're bringing this suit in New York.
One, do we have a time frame when you would expect and have a verdict in New York one way or the other by? Or do you guys have a plan?
You never know.
Okay.
I mean, it's that the time frame is impossible to predict. I think in New York, you got to get beyond the motion to dismiss first. When you look at other states, we have been since we launched in New York, since the Vergara verdict came in, been inundated with calls, as you can imagine, from parent groups, education reform groups all over the country saying, "Come here, we want to file this case, we want to file that case." What this organization has focused on, that I'm part of, is trying to build a network, really, a network of pro bono lawyers, because this is very expensive if you do it without pro bono lawyers.
Was Vergara pro bono?
No, it was not. So they've spent millions of dollars litigating that case. I don't have millions of dollars and don't want to have to raise millions of dollars. And fortunately, we have had Jay Lefkowitz, who's very passionate about this. He represents Success Academies and our charter schools on a lot of our issues. And David Boies, who is incredibly passionate about these issues, who wanted to do this pro bono and are building a team of other lawyers who care about this issue, that it's a passion of theirs and who want to do the work pro bono. So we're trying to put a network together, which we have, I think, of a pretty solid team of legal talent who can then, if a parent group in Minnesota says, we want to challenge the laws here, if a parent group in Connecticut says, we want to challenge the laws here, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. We want to say, we have lawyers who have done this already, they have the research, they have the know-how, they have the expertise. We want to connect you with them, to let them help you and support you. We also have the communications experience now, having gone through this. We have a great team, a communications team. We want to be able to help you and support you in that regard. But it would be crazy for us to try to dictate, what someone should do in, New Mexico, or who am I to say? So it really has to be driven, I think, by the local organizations on the ground.
So that said, is there a strategic plan 5 years out? Is there some idea for some number of efforts? Or?
Yes. I mean, we are examining, based on a lot of requests, sort of where this makes sense. A lot of states, you don't need to bring a case like this. It only makes sense in places like California and New York, or states where you have a legislature that has just failed to act in any way on any of these things for years, no matter how many attempts have been tried. It should be the last resort. Where you have to look at places where, no reform has been done. In some places, they've attempted reform. In New Jersey, they did some tenure reform. They still have LIFO. So it's like, it really is looking at what makes sense in terms of people wanting to do it, what the political environment is, and then also you just have to do the legal research. There are people in New Mexico who are dying to bring a case in New Mexico, but there is no constitutional language in New Mexico that would give you even a shot at winning. So it would make no sense to bring a case in New Mexico. So the most important criteria is making sure that there's something to argue, obviously, that their constitutional language is there to set some kind of floor that you could then challenge. Then it's having the local groups on the ground, having the right political environment, and having, I think, local financial support, because you can't, even with all these law firms doing this pro bono, these big firms, you are going to need local legal counsel. You've got to raise some money. And so, I think this has to be driven at the local level as opposed to some big national organization trying to dictate how this happens. Our goal is to hopefully support over the next 5 years as many as 10 states where people are trying to do this, but very much driven by the people in those states.
So, I guess one question that comes up with a lot of this, our colleague at Brookings, Matt Chingos, wrote about this just a week or two ago, that, hey, even if you change tenure laws, it's not clear in a lot of cases that districts will act on this. This is something I've written about at length in my cage-busting leadership stuff, that you'll work with districts, and it turns out a lot of stuff they can already do, the superintendent's office is just not doing. They're moving slowly. They're not addressing problems, even when they're free. What do you say to folks who say, why are you going after laws when it's a question of poor behavior by management?
Because it's both. It's both. I completely agree that there are a lot of things that management could be doing that they're not doing. I'll give you a perfect example. If you look at the front page of the New York Post or the New York Daily News, I have an op-ed in the Daily News today about this.
There is a teacher who was just arrested at Brooklyn Tech he was actually arrested back in August for, all kinds of sexual stuff with young girls. It's horrible. This teacher was arrested in August, and he still hasn't been fired. So Mayor de Blasio yesterday says he should be fired. The guy doesn't have tenure. Fire him. I mean, there's like, what are you waiting for? So no one's acted in order to get rid of this guy. I don't understand why. There are lots that the Department of Education, that school boards could be doing that they are not. That again, I go back to what I said in the speech. There are so many avenues here that have to be addressed. This is one of them. This is only one of them. It is not a silver bullet. I would not pretend it is. But it is one thing that we know is very clearly broken. So why shouldn't we try to fix it?
You know, when you were talking about providing the infrastructure for some of these efforts, both in New York and other places, you mentioned the pro bono legal support, but also the coordinating piece. It's got to cost money. The media strategy's got to cost money. So that gets us to this Twitter bombardment that I've been undergoing last 24 hours. Who's paying for this? How much money are you raising? Where's the money coming from?
So, you know, our policy on our donors is the same as AEI's policy on donors. We don't reveal our donors in order to protect their privacy if they choose to make anonymous donations. It's no different than Planned Parenthood's policy. It's no different than the League of Conservation Voters policy or hundreds of other groups. I don't know why AEI has this policy. I can tell you why we have this policy, which is because people who support this effort get attacked, in case you haven't noticed. It's been an interesting run here since we launched this effort. There are protesters out front today. I have had some pretty crazy things said about me, said about my family, said about my children, websites created that are sexist and disgusting and all kinds of stuff since I did this. I get it. You know, I'm out in front on this. I'm all in. But I also understand that someone may want to say, Campbell, I really support what you're doing, and I'm really glad you're doing this, and I want to help these kids, but I prefer not to get punched in the face every day. There has also been a very concerted effort by the other side to target people's businesses, their livelihood, threatening them, and threatening to blackball them if they support any sort of education reform effort. That's been widely reported. So I can totally understand why someone would not want to be front and center on this. Let me say this, though, also, because I think it's interesting. AEI doesn't reveal its donors, but my guess is when you go speak about education somewhere, you don't get the question, okay, Rick, why doesn't AEI reveal its donors? I'm pretty sure that Cecile Richards, the head of Planned Parenthood, when she goes to speak somewhere, no one asks her why Planned Parenthood doesn't reveal its donors. There is one reason that I am getting asked this question, that there was a Twitter bombardment, questions for Campbell, about why she doesn't reveal her donors. Because if the other side has to argue with me on the merits, they lose. They will always lose. Therefore, they have to create a distraction, a conspiracy theory, in order to take away attention from the fact that they have no argument. And I will make this very simple and very clear. School started for me and my two kids early September. I have a kindergartner and I have a first grader. And I went to school to drop my kids off. At kindergarten and first grade, I cried. I always do on the first day of school. And I left dropping them off, and I got a phone call from some parents in Forest Hills, Queens, who also had kids in first grade. And they didn't know who else to call, so they found me on my website and they called me because they had gone to drop their 6-year-olds at first grade, and they had found out that their first grade teacher, Mr. Parlini, was a man who had physically and verbally abused kids for years at their school, and that DOE had given him a small fine and sentenced him to anger management classes, and then brought him back to teach their 6-year-olds first grade. This is a guy who, one little boy who had a stutter, he brought him up to the front of the class and mocked him in front of the class and had him write on the chalkboard over and over again. This was the man who was going to be teaching their 6-year-olds first grade. So you tell me how the other side can argue that that's okay. They can't. So they have to make it about my donors or whatever else they come up with. They have to protest to try to make sure I can't get into my car, to just try to make my life miserable, because they cannot justify what's happening in that school.
So Campbell, we'll turn it over for questions and for folks who want to write in a moment. One other piece I'd just like to ask about first, though, is you touched on this in your remarks. This question of, you and I have talked about this before. I'm 100% with you, obviously, on principle. I think what tenure laws were written to do a century ago applies much less today for reasons that you talked about, civil rights laws and the rest. But I've obviously had questions about the viability of a legal strategy for addressing it. Worries about whether or not we get into a bureaucratic morass, whether we wind up just in this game of shuffleboard between the courts and a reluctant legislature, with school districts even more paralyzed on this than they are now. How do you think about those kinds of concerns about the fruits of the legal strategy?
I think of it as a last resort. You know, I think, would you have those concerns if your child was in a failing school? You know, I think it is not the first thing you want to try. I mean, I would love it if we could get this done in Albany. Nothing would make me happier. I'm sure the folks in California would love it if they could have gotten it done in Sacramento. But when you have legislatures where the union essentially is in control, and for years, not even the slightest reform has had a shot at making any movement through the legislative process, and you have parents who literally are, you know, waking up every day wondering if their kids are going to make it. You know, if I were in that position, I'd do whatever it took. I would do whatever it took to try to give my kids a shot, and that's all they want to do. And this is the only avenue that's open to them. So why shouldn't we? Is it potentially going to be messy and complicated? Sure. I mean, because if we win and the judge declares tenure as it's currently written unconstitutional, what it means is that we go back to Albany and we have to figure out what the new tenure law looks like. I have ideas for what I think it should look like. I'm sure a lot of other people do too. But we're going to have to be able to come to some sort of compromise that hopefully is better than what we currently have. And maybe we don't make it through the entire legal process. I mean, maybe, you know, maybe this is just the hammer that breaks through sort of the logjam that's existed in our legislature or in other states where, you know, it's just been inaction and inertia, and how do you wake people up? Is this potentially, you know, the beginning of a conversation that wakes people up about what's really going on and forces a conversation and forces a debate so that there actually will be legislative action and we don't have to take this through the entire legal process?
All right, with that, let's go ahead and open it up. We've got, Jen's got mics, and Elizabeth over here. And, hold on, so, Elizabeth, who is that? Sarah? Elizabeth, okay, good. That's what happens when I take my glasses off. Be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. As always, I'm going to ask that questions actually be questions. If we get 15 seconds in and I can't spot the question, we're going to give somebody else a chance. And Mike, you give me a holler whenever somebody's got something that we want to throw in the mix. Jen, get us started, please.
Claudio Sanchez from National Public Radio. You started by saying that this is not just about tenure, it's about a system of state laws that are not serving children well. Could you give us other examples of what state laws you're referring to?
So tenure is...
And a follow-up, if I may.
Yeah, sure. We're addressing several laws in our lawsuit, which is tenure. Tenure is one of them. The teacher dismissal protections, the way they're written in New York, are a separate law. It's called 3020A. So that is what I described in the speech in dealing with the arbitration process, where an arbitrator, as opposed to, has a final say over what happens, as opposed to the school's chancellor or school board being sort of the final arbiter on these decision-making process, in addition to last in, first out seniority, which is another separate law. So it's how these three laws work in conjunction with one another.
My follow-up is the parent trigger law that is also making its way through many states and at some point maybe even some courts. Do you ever see your efforts dovetailing with other efforts like that?
So it's interesting, not parent trigger specifically, but lots of people have reached out to us to say, hey, could you, consider looking at a charter funding equity lawsuit. One has been brought recently in New York State on that issue. A lot of other topics have come up where people are suddenly thinking litigation, much to your dismay, is the answer to all their problems. To me, again, this should be driven by the local communities and the people in the state who understand what the problems are in that state, because it's different in every state. I mean, education is different in every state. There are different challenges. It has to be driven by what the needs are there. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out if someone came to us and said, hey, can you help us find pro bono legal help and help us raise money for a charter funding equity case. I would turn to our lawyers and say, hey, is anybody interested in this? Because I know a lot of them are. A lot of them are already working on a lot of the charter issues. So we are not by any means just focusing in terms of the organizational kind of infrastructure that we're building. We're not intent on limiting it to just tenure, LIFO, and dismissal protections. I know David Boies is very interested in other areas where he'd like to pursue legal action. We've had requests that run the gamut. So I would really leave that up to the local organizations and the lawyers to decide how best to pursue it and what's most needed in that state.
But specifically in the case of parent trigger, that would be one that you would be open to?
Sure. It's been less. There was a parent trigger bill in New York. It hasn't been a huge issue in New York in the way it has been in some other states, so it's not something we spend a lot of time talking about. But there's nothing I would rule out. And
just to clarify a little bit, do you see yourself primarily as a resource for the legal avenue? Or when you talked about in some states, look, legislatures might be amenable to this, would you also be involved in a legislative route in those other cases? So
my view on the legislative piece is, in terms of building an organization, a nonprofit, I think if you try to do too many things, you fail. I think it's better for us to stay very focused on this piece of the puzzle and do it really well, and then hopefully find partnerships or build partnerships to address the legislative piece. Because I think one of the things they're finding in California is because Vergara was so surprising to a lot of us who thought that was going to happen, I think even they were surprised by it. There wasn't a parallel legislative strategy, meaning, oh my gosh, we won. Now what do? We got to pass a tenure bill. So we need to make sure that there is a parallel legislative strategy that works in conjunction with litigation where it's being brought. But I'm not sure that we are the organization to do both. I think it's very hard to do both. I think in a perfect world, I would want to find the organization, and we're talking to a number of people who could play this role in New York, for example, who would then develop the legislative piece of this to make their focus on Albany and figure out what the new tenure law should look like, and how it should, where we could potentially find compromise.
Elizabeth?
Hi, I'm Stephen Salchuk with EdWeek, and my question is actually, you mentioned that you had some ideas about how a revised tenure law would look, and I just was interested in hearing what those might be, and also what the 3020A process might look like when revised, given the report that also came out this morning from AEI on 3020A.
Yeah, and we should mention that because Catherine has done this really extraordinary report. She's a new addition to the AI team that, she must have foiled, I don't know how many years. She went back and looked at all of the transcripts of these hearings around these dismissal cases that we're talking about, abusive, incompetent teachers, and some of the information, the research she's put together is really astounding. Okay, so your question, sorry, tenure. Look, I don't pretend to have all the answers here, but I do think that other people who are much smarter than I have put forward some ideas that seem to be pretty grounded in common sense and make a lot of sense. TNTP, for example, had a paper that came out last week, Rick and I were talking about, where they, had proposed a new tenure law that would essentially set, and I should be clear, I don't believe that tenure should just be abolished, nor do I think that's possible in a place like New York. But a tenure law which set a time limit at 5 years that ensured that tenure decisions were based on performance, that there was a quality measure in that, and that if a teacher got an ineffective rating 2 years in a row, they would lose tenure, so that there is accountability that is maintained throughout. To me, that sounds pretty reasonable. Is that a place that you could get people in Albany to agree? Again, that's part of a legislative strategy, but I think there are a lot of reasonable solutions that have been put forward on the dismissal piece. I mean, to me, the idea that the final say on whether an abusive teacher stays or goes, or an incompetent teacher stays or goes, should lie with someone who has no accountability, and who is, again, in this sort of bizarrely incentivized system where they don't have the freedom to make truly independent decisions, makes no sense. I think that the power to remove a teacher, there should still be an arbitration process, but the arbitrator should make a recommendation that the chancellor in New York City, for example, would either follow that recommendation or overrule it. The chancellor is responsible for kids. The buck stops with the chancellor and the mayor, or outside of New York City with the school board. The school district bears the ultimate responsibility. They should have the final say. It just blows my mind that we would outsource, this kind of decision making to someone who has no accountability.
Jen? Oh, Mike.
Thanks so much. I would like to begin by saying there's no possible way that I will get all of the Twitter questions in here. You'll be able to see them later. What I'm going to try and do is just combine some of them that ask similar questions in sort of one question for you. And one sort of repeated theme that I've seen in lots of tweets that are headed our way, which is sort of like, why this set of policies? So some folks are saying, look, people are entering lawsuits about funding equity. People were talking about why not more teacher professional development or teacher preparation or any of those. So why does your lawsuit focus on this particular set of policies?
I mean, that's a great question. Like, I'm one person. I can't do everything. I would love to solve every problem. I go back to what I said before. I would never pretend that this is a silver bullet that is going to address all of our problems in our public schools, not even remotely so. But it is a glaringly obvious problem that is so easily fixable. I mean, this problem is purely political. I mean, it's not when you talk about how do we address poverty in the home and the impact that has on, I mean, there's so many factors that go into that. This is not happening for one reason, politics. And so it's fixable to me in a very clear and what should be easy, simple way, versus things that are much harder. I mean, God, I'd love to tackle every single one of these problems, and hopefully other people will address this, and but you can't do everything. And my view is always, okay, if you can't fix every problem, do you just say, okay, I'm not fixing any problem? I'm not going to try to address any solution? I have to save every kid, or I won't save any children? I just don't buy that. We do what we can, and we try to focus where we can and where we see we have an avenue to address something, and we do it.
So, building on that, Campbell, I think, you know this. A lot of educators say, all right, I kind of hear you, but it feels punitive. Mike, the question came in about professional development. Professional development stinks. Teachers aren't getting the help they need to do their job well. And it feels like you're saying the response does not help you do your job well, but make it easier to fire you.
If you're an incompetent teacher, yeah. But it's punitive to who? It's punitive to incompetent teachers. It's not punitive to a young teacher who gets a pink slip every year in California because she doesn't have seniority. It's the opposite of punitive for that person. So it's punitive for teachers who are worried about their competency. I mean, that's who it's punitive for. So let's be honest about that. I mean, other things you talk about, like teacher development and teacher training, and this has certainly come up around Common Core. All the frustration that teachers are feeling as we try to implement Common Core about not being prepared for this. And some, implementation, as you certainly know, has been a disaster in some places. It's been better in other places. But I like in New York City, teacher training, it would be great if teachers could have more time to prepare and train. Guess what the New York City teacher contract says? That they don't have to come back until the day before school starts. So when exactly are we going to do teacher training? That they don't have to stay 30 minutes after the end of the school day. When exactly do you do teacher training? I mean, I'm on the board of Success Academies. Our teachers come back weeks before school starts. They're constantly doing training. They work crazy hours. They get paid more. I mean, this is where I agree that like a starting salary for a New York City teacher is, you can't live on it. I mean, we've really failed to address that. And so I understand when there's teacher frustration that you want to take away tenure and that's all I got. You're paying me nothing. That I agree with, and that I totally think we should be addressing. But the teacher training piece, the things you're talking about, we got to have a partner who's willing to work with us on this stuff. And I don't see. I mean, we certainly, now granted our mayor is a very, very close to the United Federation of Teachers, obviously. So this was not somebody who was going to challenge them on many of these issues, like come back to school a few days early. But, we have to have some give and take on this contract stuff, or we can't address these problems.
Jen? Oh, Elizabeth?
The Dimitri Melhorn with Private Citizen.
Hi, Dimitri.
Hello. The 3020 proceedings were amended in 2012 after much of this research has been done. Does that affect your case? Have there been any implications or implementation of that weakens your case at all?
So let me tell you how they were amended. We hear this from a lot of other sides. They say, oh no, we fixed that problem. We adopted the Feinberg recommendations. We put time limits on how long these cases could go forward. Well, okay, so that doesn't get to the fundamental problem, which I talked about, which is the arbitrator. So if the arbitrator is incentivized to give a lenient sentence, and he has to now do it more quickly, great. He's just putting the child predator back in the classroom faster than he was before. I mean, I don't find that to be a solution. Getting bad teachers back into the classroom more quickly, that's your adjustment, You've got to address the fundamental problem. And if you don't go to the heart of the problem, and this is why I think people feel like more radical steps like a lawsuit have to be taken, because what they've seen is attempts at reform have been so around the edges that they almost feel like they're just meant to appease people as opposed to actually addressing the problem. And unfortunately, that's what we've let go on too long.
Jen? Oh, Mike?
Another question from Twitter, again, trying to aggregate a few of them. Do you worry about removing tenure or some of these protections as harming the process of recruiting high-quality teachers? You had sort of touched on that in a previous answer that you gave, that it's part of the package that kind of goes with compensating teachers, et cetera. Do you worry that removing tenure might harm efforts to attract more high-quality teachers?
Sure. So I don't, again, I go back to let's not remove it, let's reform it. But I also think, I read, Pedro Noguera maybe wrote this piece for the Wall Street Journal. I can't remember who or where I read it. This was a while ago. But it was about tenure being used as an incentive. And his argument was, against what we were trying to do, because if you take away tenure, how are you going to get people to teach in high-risk neighborhoods? Because what otherwise would be the incentive for being there? Well, how is it an incentive if everybody has tenure? If you want to use tenure as an incentive to get people to teach in more challenging schools, then you have to only give tenure to those people teaching in the challenging schools. Otherwise, it's not an incentive. So it just didn't even make sense to me. But yeah, I do. again, I don't want to remove it altogether. I think we have to reform it and make it better. But there's a lot that has to be done in order to make it appealing in this country to be a teacher again. And that goes to the heart of treating teachers like professionals, which means paying them more, giving them performance-based pay, doing away with last in, first out. I mean, something, when you're letting people go based on seniority alone, that's not a true profession. I mean, it's not fair. Why would any young teacher, again, knowing their first few years, want to go into that profession when they could get a pink slip at any point in time?
And so Campbell, so what do you say to somebody who says, all right, so I agree with you on LIFO, but on the tenure stuff, the deal you're proposing sounds reasonable, but let's start with making teaching more rewarding and attractive, and then worry about fixing tenure. What do you say to folks?
I think we have to do both. I think we have to do, I don't know why we have to do one or the other. I never understand people who are like, well, no, we have to prioritize it this way. Look, we have to do everything. So let's do it. You lead the fight for getting teachers higher pay, and I'll work on the tenure piece. I mean, join the effort. I'm all for it. But this argument from people about, why aren't you working on this piece? Why aren't you, this is what we're doing. It is a very obvious, very fixable problem that has been sitting in front of us that we can easily address. It is a political problem, and why we wouldn't solve a problem that we can solve because there are other problems that have to be solved is just a nonsensical argument to me. Yeah, sorry.
Elizabeth?
Hi, my name's Dave Price, and I've spent 33 years working in education, 20 of those representing people who were charged with tenure. And I say all that to say that I promise I will not stalk you or protest outside. I don't think we're all that way, so I'm going to speak for the others. And there's a reason I feel comfortable saying that. The three issues that you've addressed are broken. Okay, that part is true. I'm going to speak, I can step way outside here and speak for your teachers, but I think where the uncomfortable part comes is what replaces it. And you've addressed some of that today. And I don't know if this is so much a question. As a reporter, I should ask a better question. But the idea of it is, part of this gets at what is a good teacher, okay? And that's a very amorphous thing. We know, and it's different. If you went to Denver right now, it'd be something else. So I wondered if you could just, in your own mind, say, what do you feel a good teacher is? The Campbell Brown definition.
That's a really great question and a really hard question. But I think it's a, let me say that the vast majority of teachers are really good teachers. It's someone who's working hard and cares about their kids and is trying to get them to a better place. I mean, it's really pretty basic, simple stuff. Unfortunately, and I think this is always our problem, because teachers feel under attack by this. Some teachers do. A lot of teachers don't, by the way, and they've been very supportive, and I'm appreciative of that. But for me, this is about the kids, isn't it? And we spend a lot of time talking about teachers, but isn't this about the kids? And shouldn't that be driving our thinking around this stuff? Like, our public education system is not designed for teachers. It's designed for children. It's designed to teach children. So shouldn't that be how we think about every decision we make? So, when you say, shouldn't we deal with paying teachers better? Yeah, but if you use that as the measure for every sort of thought process you have about what your priorities should be, how you should address things, if you begin with, is this good for kids? Is this good for kids? Does this make things better for a child in the classroom? Then I think that helps you sort of clear away some of the cobwebs, And, if the teacher you're talking about is connecting with kids and, they're growing and they're improving and they're, how you objectively measure that. I mean, look, I'm not someone who's like, one standardized test can tell me that that's a good teacher. I mean, the testing stuff, of course we should have a test. It should be a small part of what makes the determination in a teacher evaluation. I believe there has to be some kind of teacher evaluation system. But
would you place more weight on peer observation, principal observation, student-parent surveys? What are the pieces that you think about?
I think they're all pieces, but I mean, I've never thought that testing should be more than 30% ever of what we do. I just don't think you can I mean, testing is so different for different kids, and no one can design the perfect test. We should have them, but it should not, and I think also there's just so much so much misinformation about this, and about the debate around this, that, you know, those ed reformers, they're all about testing. They want, you know, a test to decide whether a teacher's good or bad. I've never heard anyone ever say that. Have you? I mean, a test to decide? That's like absurd. You know, smarter people, much smarter people than me, you maybe, could decide what the percentages are, but
Not me. Smarter than me.
But it's you know, it can be more thoughtful than it is, and I think fundamentally all the issues that we're talking about, you know, what always gets lost to this, and maybe maybe it's just because I'm a parent and I come at this purely as like, I wake up thinking about kids. I wake up thinking about kids and what's best for kids, and that drives all of my decision making around how I think about this stuff, and I think that's how parents think about this stuff. And, you know, unfortunately, parents don't get a seat at the table during contract negotiations. They don't get to say, hey, I'd really like a few more days for professional development in here. They don't get to say, hey, I'd like my parent-teacher conference to be more than 2.5 minutes, as it is in New York City. They don't get to, you know, to be a participant in these conversations. They should, in my view, but they don't. So I have, you know, and maybe it's not fair. Maybe I don't give nearly enough weight to the teacher perspective, and because I don't have it. I have the parent perspective and I have the child perspective, and that's how I come at everything. And so I will certainly get things wrong because of that. But I do believe fundamentally that this is what it should be about, our kids, first and foremost.
Elizabeth?
Stacy Childress, New Schools Venture Fund. Campbell, a few minutes ago you said something that frankly surprised me a little bit, so I'd like to come back to it. You acknowledged that in New York it's probably impossible to not have tenure, and so you have to reform it. But then you said, and you wouldn't want to do that anyway, so abolish tenure, that we should just reform it. Because in some states we don't have it. And so I appreciate the clarity of a number of your arguments this morning, and I'm wondering how you'd make the positive case for tenure. Like, if we need to have it, what's the positive case for tenure?
I think it can be better than it currently is. I mean, the positive case for tenure is, I'm a realist. I mean, honestly, I would prefer that, you know, as Rick said, that we pay teachers much more than we currently pay teachers, that there are much greater incentives on the performance side than we currently have. But, and then you could do away with tenure, because you would have many other things that would make this attractive to people to be part of this profession. It would really, but that gets to what you're talking about. How do we really professionalize teaching so it's a job that people want and are excited about doing and are rewarded for? I think we, unfortunately, are a ways away from getting there. So I go back to what I said before, just removing tenure without addressing any of the other things that Rick talked about, teacher pay or anything else, isn't fair. That, you know, we can't do it. We can't, so we have to be able to find some workable compromise that makes sense, which means accountability, which is you get to ineffective ratings and you lose your tenure, so that it isn't a lifetime permanent job, that it means something. What you're talking about, if you want to get rid of tenure, in my view, you have to do the other stuff. You have to make this a profession that attracts the best and the brightest and that people want to be part of.
Campbell, so even in those circumstances, so say you've got, you know, terrific opportunities in terms of pay and professional growth. What about the argument that you need tenure to some degree because you get principals who have vendettas against individual teachers, because teachers get assigned to schools where it's enormously difficult to succeed, And so even if you make the profession attractive, individual teachers are going to need some kind of.
But you still can't. I mean, you can't fire a teacher without cause. You know, I mean, look, I mean, I'm sorry, but we all experience that in our profession. You know, if you and Arthur Brooks are going at it, like, things are not going to be pleasant, right? I mean, the current law, I agree that the current civil rights laws in the book, I mean, tenure was created not to address that, but to address, you know, what was happening with women and African Americans who were being fired for other reasons that were taken care of under our civil rights laws. It morphed into what you're talking about, and we hear that a lot, but I think, I just don't think that is the fundamental issue here.
Elizabeth?
Thank you. My name is Roberta Stanley. I'm a former journalist too, and for years I was the supervisor of the teacher tenure office in Michigan. I'm proud to say we reformed it, and we also had criminal history checks. But I'm inclined to mention that it wasn't that long ago that women couldn't be married or pregnant and teach, and that in small towns like where I grew up, you had to go to a specific church if you were a teacher. And, you know, that kind of protection, as you mentioned, is very important. But I think you glossed over too readily the issue of supervisors, principals, and superintendents, if you will, not doing their job in documenting. Because we were in a union state in Michigan. We're right to work now, but we were a union state. We got rid of bad teachers. And I think you need to work with the colleges of teacher education so that those leaders in the schools need to, and would you comment on that before you cut me off? Thank you.
Thanks, Bert.
Yeah, I mean, it is, again, I go back, this is a much bigger problem than just the very narrow piece that we're talking about today. But you know, yes, they don't document, and they don't. I understand why. It's so hard. I went to see this principal at a New York high school, just to this was a while ago when I was just trying to understand the process more, and I said, okay, so, you know, is there a teacher that you think you need to get rid of? And he's like, oh my God, there's this one teacher, and his was one of the top 10 schools in the city. I've been trying to get rid of for 7 years. And I said, well, what do you do? Like, how are you doing it? Like, what does it mean? He goes, sit right here, and he put me at a conference table, and he went back into his office, and he came out with this box that was like this big, and he threw it on the table, this gigantic box filled with documents, and he said, 7 years I've been collecting these documents, 7 years, and this year I think I'm going to be able to get rid of this teacher. He was like, he was so proud of, like, you know, it was so clear he had put in this time and this energy and this effort to proving that he knew this was the one teacher in his school who was not living up in any way, but that it was going to take him, he knew enough about how the process works that it would require that level of effort from him. Now, granted, he was a committed principal who was trying to make sure that every teacher in his school was a good teacher. So he was willing to do that kind of work. But given, you know, the responsibilities school administrators and principals have, that's a lot of work to ask them to do. They should be doing it. I'm not, you know, I wish I could tell you that everybody was like this guy.
But wouldn't you in an investigative news story do the same kind of documentation?
Well, I was in television, so. Documentation. You want us to do research?
Although Russert was famed for this, right?
Yes,
he would tear into
homework. He did do his homework.
Campbell, it's 10:30. Thank you so much for a terrific
You're welcome.
conversation
You're
this
welcome.
morning.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.